one of the key things to add to that is that you alluded to it earlier. If they can articulate how they can help you and how they can, I guess, simplify a complex situation, that's a lot better because you don't want to be, I call it passing the sleep test. You don't want to be losing sleep at night when you're making these decisions, right? It's got to pass the sleep test. It's got to make sense so that you're absolutely comfortable before moving forward. Because if you're not comfortable, you might have some doubt in there. And if you're doubting yourself in any kind of situation, once you're trying to acquire a property, well, it could be, you could miss out. G'day everyone, it's Andrew David Courtney here. I welcome Chantal O'Brien, who is a mortgage broker who's going to tell us exactly what steps you need to take to ensure that you have a nice smooth run at acquiring your first property or potentially your second, third or fourth property. Welcome Chantal, how you doing?
Thanks Andrew, thanks for having me. I'm well, thank you.
I'm glad to have you here. Look, in the end, what I'd love to ask you is, how'd you get to where you are? What's your origin story?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in lending on and off for over 20 years in a variety of roles. I went away for a little while and ran my own business in a completely different industry for about 10 years and then bounced back into finance. So it tends to be where I bounce back to. I enjoy it. I enjoy looking after people. So yeah, that's basically how I've ended up back in this space again.
Awesome. And what kind of business did you run?
I actually owned a couple of gyms. I still do. So in the fitness industry. So I still do a little bit of coaching. I have a couple of key clients that I've had for a very long time that I like to continue working with. So that's my other part-time job, which I do early in the mornings before I go to my real job, as I call it.
Oh, good on you. So you're a bit of a health fanatic as well then, I assume.
I am, yes.
Nice. So tell me, how long have you been working in NAB for?
So this time around, I've been back since the start of the year, so going on 7 or 8 months now. But before going into the gym industry, I'd been in the bank for 13 years, up until having my first child, had a little break, then went back into a small business role, which was completely different again, and then left again to go and open and buy my first gym. Yeah, awesome. So, like I said, on and off for over 20 years.
So plenty of experience then, hey?
Absolutely. Through before the Royal Banking Commission and after. So it's definitely a very different landscape to when I first started. So
yeah. Good stuff. So question for you, Chantal, like a lot of people tend to put themselves in an awkward situation when looking for finance. So what I'd love to ask you is, well, what kind of key tips would you be providing someone who's looking to acquire their first or an investment property?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And I mean, there's so many things that I can suggest, but I liken your lender to a doctor. You know, if you start seeing a GP or a specialist for a particular health concern and you don't like or gel with that person, or you don't feel that you've got good communication with that person, shop around until you find someone that you feel comfortable with and someone that you feel you have a good relationship with, because that person is going to be fairly key in that purchase. If you don't feel like you're getting the right information or you're getting things as quickly as you would like, shop around and develop a relationship with a lender, someone that you will keep going back to. You hear people have a GP for their entire life, for their whole family. I like to think that a lender can also be that person. And that's the type of relationship I try to develop with my customers, that they would never look anywhere else because they'll always bounce back to me because of that relationship. So I think the first and foremost thing is find someone that you feel very comfortable with and that you feel will certainly serve you in that process.
So am I right in saying that you shouldn't be getting into any other contracts prior to finding a lender then? Is that right?
I think it's important. I think having, your ducks in a row before you go and sign a contract is really important. It's at least once a fortnight I'll have someone come to me, and I've got one this week, and they'll come to me and say, I've signed a contract. But they haven't actually spoken to anyone about what the finance will look like. Can they get the finance approved? What's the interest rate? What's the cost? What's your upfront costs? Having a really good idea of not just what your government costs are going to be, but your conveyancing, your removalist. There's all these other things that can come into play. And if you haven't spoken to a lender or a broker prior to signing that contract, you might not have enough money. So you might get the finance approved, but you can't pay for all of the other bits and pieces that actually are critically important to a purchase. So talking to a lender first up, and a lender who has a holistic approach and will make sure they cover all of those costs and all of that process with you, can certainly take some of the stress out of that initial period where you're waiting for finance.
So I'm curious, what are those costs? I really want to, if you can just line them up for the audience, that would be amazing.
The upfront costs, so things to think about. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So, obviously you've got your government fees and charges. So the government will always dip in when you make a purchase. So you want to think about, your transfer stamp duties, your registration fees. If you've got a property to sell as well, there's going to be some discharge fees. Now, they're all different state to state. So depending on the state that you're in, and then whether or not you'll be living in the property or if it's an investment property, that will impact the costs involved in that purchase. But then there's the other things that people often don't get a quote on until after they've signed a contract. And one of those would be a conveyancer. It's strongly discouraged to enter into a purchase or a settlement process without a conveyancer. That's their job. They're there for a reason, and they will do all of the necessary searches and attend settlement for you. But you need to know what their cost is going to be. And that can range from anywhere. I've seen it range from $1,200 to $2,500 and sometimes more if there's complications with those searches. Then you've got the costs associated with searches, and they're critically important for properties to make sure that there's not going to be an issue with the property that you're purchasing. Other things to think about if you are moving into the property, you've got removalist costs, you've got cleaning costs for the property that you're exiting. And then if you're moving out of a rental, and this often happens, if there's any issues with the rental when you exit, you may have some costs there, costs incurred for repairs and things like that. So there's all those other little bits and pieces that people don't factor into. They often just think, well, I've got my deposit, I'm good to go. Now, if you've got less than 20% deposit, you're likely that you'll need to pay lender's mortgage insurance as well. And that is usually an upfront cost unless you have a lender that will capitalise that cost. And that can be up in the tens of thousands of dollars as well. So it just comes back to, if we circle back to what's the first thing you should do before you buy a property, it's talk to your lender first.
Yeah, absolutely. So borrowing capacity and understanding what your borrowing capacity is key, right? One of the first key steps, because ultimately your borrowing capacity will determine what kind of properties you're actually capable of buying. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So talk us through how long, what's the process of actually getting a borrowing capacity for someone, let's say coming off the street, really curious about what they can buy. Let's say hypothetically they give you a buzz and say, well, I'd like to know what my borrowing capacity looks like. What are the next steps?
So I'm going to just differentiate, first of all, if you don't mind, just between borrowing capacity and pre-approval, because someone will call often and say, I just want to know what my borrowing capacity is. That's not a pre-approval, and it's really important that people understand that. So a borrowing capacity is pump in some numbers or on a piece of paper, like we'll do loan on a page, for example, based on what someone's told me, I can tell them what their borrowing capacity would be. But that's not an approval. So that's not information that's been verified. It's not, the credit check hasn't been completed. That is literally just income in, expenses out. This is what you can potentially borrow based on that information. We can do that in 5 to 10 minutes because that's just a couple of calculations. A pre-approval is that stage where you know that amount is actually approved. So we've done the credit check. Usually we've done the majority of the verifications. And a pre-approval is usually subject to the bank doing a valuation of the property that you're purchasing to ensure that they're happy with the security and finalising any verifications, so income or any other information that's been provided. But you have a lot more certainty with a pre-approval than you do with a borrowing capacity. Yeah. The other thing to be aware of is if you've got a borrowing capacity in the current landscape that we're in and the interest rates keep going up by 0.5% every month at the moment, your borrowing capacity that you were given perhaps at the start of September may have changed significantly because of that 0.5%, because it does have an impact on the cost of those funds for you. So if you have only got a borrowing capacity and not a pre-approval, you need to keep revisiting that if you're still on the market looking for a property. Whereas depending on the lender, your pre-approval will last for the 90 days.
Yeah, I'm with you. And out of the percentage of clients that you deal with, what percentage goes in with a pre-approval prior to acquiring versus no pre-approval?
For me personally, I like to get the pre-approval done up front because it provides a lot more certainty. But the other thing is it allows them to go in with a bit of a competitive edge. They can go in and offer a shorter finance clause. So, usually I'll say to my clients with the pre-approval, just go in and offer 7 days rather than the 14 or 21, and it gives them a little bit of an edge. So I would say 80 to 90% of my clients have a pre-approval before they go and place an offer. It's just the surprise ones that I get on a Sunday or a Monday where they've accidentally bought a property or they've accidentally gone to an auction where they've only had a borrowing capacity, which we can still deal with, but it's not as smooth as if you've got a pre-approval on the table.
I imagine there'd be quite a lot of scrambling around, trying to gather as much documents and financial statements and the like to try and get this thing over the line. But yeah, it's one of those times where if you're not prepared, you could be up for a volatile situation and a very, very stressful one at that. I remember the first time I bought my first property. The first time I bought my first property, unfortunately, I didn't have a lender who was happy to guide me through and hold my hand throughout the whole process. And I felt that the whole world was against me. So yes. For those of you who haven't had an experience or don't have a lender in your team, because ideally you want to have a team around you, surrounding you to ensure that you have a smooth process, you need to get that right because that situation may be scarring and you may put yourself out of the game completely because of that negative situation. Yeah. So what are the kind of horror stories that you've seen? Like if you were to paint me a picture of what's not ideal, what does that look like?
I don't come across a lot because I'm organized with my clients. So I'll preface it with that. But I think, the emotional purchase where someone's gone to an auction or they've signed a contract on a Saturday without speaking to their lender, half of the time that's not going to go smoothly because you haven't done your checks. Like you said, you haven't got your team in place, first of all. And your team, I'm a big fan of the team. You need your conveyancer. I think a buyer's agent is critically important if you're wanting to get the right price. Having the right real estate agent on your team is important as well. So having all of those people in place. But, we've got one at the moment where the property's not valuing where it needed to. So just because you're prepared to pay a certain price for something doesn't mean the bank is going to support that purchase. And there are areas if we talk about Queensland in particular, there are areas in Queensland where there are some concerns around security. So doing your research around the area that you're buying into, making sure, and that's again where the searches come into it as well, but just making sure that area that you're buying into isn't one of those higher risk areas. Flood zones are also going to be an issue in Brisbane now as an example. So just doing your research and not rushing into a purchase and not making an emotional purchase, 9 times out of 10 will save you. And have, like I said, having your team. But yeah, there's always going to be horror stories in our industry. And hand on heart, I would say most of them are due to an emotional purchase.
Yes. So it's key to be prepared, obviously.
Yeah. And look, as a lender, we can do postcode checks. We can do, checks on addresses before you put an offer in. Like I do appraisals for my clients before they put the offer in so that we can flag any concerns up front. And that, again, it just comes down to being organised.
Yeah, that's awesome. And but you alluded to a point earlier, and I just want to kind of drill a little bit deeper on that one. The areas or regions that wouldn't get you lending, what kind of areas? Can you give us some examples of those kinds of areas?
Yeah, look, it changes constantly. And there's 2 areas that we need to be aware of. One, will the bank accept the security? And then 2, if you're dipping into that lender's mortgage insurance territory, they have some postcode restrictions as well. So you've got 2 areas that we have to check if you're going into lender's mortgage insurance territory. But places that we want to be aware of, and I won't name areas because it changes constantly. So from a longevity point of view, I'll keep it neutral, but you want to think about things like flood areas, fire areas, areas where, the soil could be impacted by some kind of chemical. Mining towns tend to go up and down a little bit as well. So we do have some issues there. And then your rurals. So if you're going into rural or rural lifestyle, you're moving into a territory where we may shade the lending against the property a little bit lower as well. So, and bank to bank, all of the policies are different as well. So I guess that's where going to a broker can also be very useful, because they can help find a lender that will actually, if you're going into, say, a rural lifestyle, a lender that will support that purchase versus some that won't. But I mean, if you're buying a property to live in, ideally you probably don't want to buy it in a flood zone, as an example. So making sure that you have checked that and making a really informed decision about that purchase as well. So yeah, things like that are the things that you want to look out for.
And islands too, right?
Yes.
That's another thing. There's a few small islands in the Bay Area here in Brisbane that unfortunately all banks don't seem to like to lend against.
Yes.
There's only a few banks that will happily lend against those ones, which is interesting.
Yes,
Yeah,
and look, banks tend to be a glass half empty kind of industry. So as much as I'm a glass half full kind of person, my role is very much to look at every possible thing that could go wrong, and that's what we do as lenders.
Yeah, and part and parcel of it is risk mitigation, right? Like far too many people come into these deals thinking they're going to get the ideal kind of a streamlined result, and unfortunately, if they don't dot their I's and cross their T's, they get caught out a little bit. So on that note, then what's the most ideal kind of I guess step-by-step process for someone to get finance? How does it actually look?
And look, I think we all have a different opinion on this in our various industries. But if I look at the workflows that have gone the most smoothly, or the most comfortable client experience, is going to be someone that's first of all getting advice from a financial advisor or a wealth creation specialist or a financial planner, someone who is having a look at their overall scenario and going, this is going to be a great long-term suggestion or strategy for you. Someone that's got some deposit behind them, not necessarily just a gifted deposit, but have actually demonstrated the ability to save to a certain point, noting that in this day and age, to save the amount of deposit that people need to get into the market is very challenging. So it's pretty unusual for me to have a first home buyer come in that hasn't got some portion of that gifted, but we want to see that you've got the ability to save and consistently put that money away. So someone that also has done their research and they understand the costs associated. 8 times out of 10, my first home buyers have no idea what a conveyancer does, why they need them, and what they're going to cost. And so that's usually where I send them first. So understanding that process as well. But also just taking the time to educate yourself, like understand, what is a mortgage? What does that actually do? Read the loan documents, understand what you're actually signing up for. Like I've got someone at the moment that doesn't understand even what that mortgage document is. So taking the time to really understand that, and that there's so many resources available to understand and educate yourself on what that process looks like. But someone that's educated themselves, have got the deposit saved or at least part of it, and are under good advice, they're going to have a smooth process. And take the emotion out of the purchase. I'll always come back to that. Take the emotion out of the purchase, because that's when people will make the most mistakes.
So let's skip to, you get the pre-approval, and then you're now under contract. Let's say you found that perfect property. You're now under contract. What happens next from that?
So your lender needs that contract straight away. So as soon as we get that contract, we order a valuation on that property to ensure that the bank's happy with that process. If your pre-approval's already done, the process from there is very straightforward. We finalise that. We move that to a formal approval. For where I work with NAB, that's a very quick, easy process. If we need to update pay slips, we update pay slips so that we've got current verification documents. Then we send it for verifications, which is an external process. From there, it clicks over to a formal approval unless there's some issues with any element of that file. Once you've got your formal approval, it moves to documentation. So documents are signed, mortgage is signed, and then we book settlement. So as you can see, if you've got that pre-approval in place, that process is very quick and easy. It's not unusual for me to have mortgage documents in front of someone within a couple of days from signing a contract if they were organised at the start. In the event that you've got someone that sends a contract with nothing done at the start, we start at that home loan interview point and we start the application. So there are a couple more steps to get to that formal approval, which is where some stress can come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And during that process as well, are you referring building and pest inspectors as well, for the clients too, so that they can get that side of things sorted.
We definitely suggest it. I don't personally refer them to anybody. I certainly can refer to a conveyancer, but I always suggest it. I think it's critically important to have that done as well as your finance. So when signing a contract, you obviously want to sign your contract subject to finance and subject to building and pest. And ideally giving yourself that couple of weeks for building and pest so that you've got the time to check the property over.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, I guess, getting finance, right? So a lot of people fall flat because they don't particularly get the pre-approval. They made that emotional purchase. They're struggling to gather all their documents together. What happens if finance gets to a stage where it's starting to get really, really close? What are their options then?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of with their lender.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, your lender will always have the ability to escalate the finance to try and get it through quicker for them. But the quicker you can get things to your lender, the less likely that is to happen. So, the minute you sign that contract, get that contract to your lender. Don't push back on giving them the information they need. And that does happen to us sometimes. People question why they need to send pay slips or statements. There is a reason for all of that. And the quicker you can get that information in front of your lender, the less stressful that process is going to be. Because ideally, we want finance done a couple of days before it's due. We don't want to be getting to 4 p.m. on the day of finance, still waiting for that approval. And the only times that has ever happened for me is when there's been a lag in getting the information from the client. Your lender can move fast. You just got to get the information to them as early as possible so that they can do that for you. If you don't have a pre-approval, don't sign a 7-day finance. It's not going to be enough time. So sign a 14-day unless you've got that pre-approval and you've agreed with the lender that you're going to do that. So that's really important. So you don't want to be, because you've got to remember your lender's probably also got other clients that have got finance due. So, giving yourself as much time so you can breathe through that process is really important because no one wants it to be stressful. It shouldn't be a stressful process for anybody.
Yeah, fair enough. And what if finance doesn't come through? Obviously, there's the extension option as well, but that puts the contract at risk because the vendor may be able to pull out, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and look, I'm not a conveyancer or solicitor, so you would then need to speak to your conveyancer about whether or not you pull out of that contract under your finance clause, which then requires your lender to send a declined letter. Or look to extend it. But that comes into where your conveyancer can certainly help you in making the right decision and also the least costly decision at that point because there can be some costs associated depending on what you've negotiated at signing of contract.
Yes, because our worst case scenario, obviously we're not conveyancers, we're not solicitors, but our worst case scenario, if it goes over that unconditional moment, the finance moment where you're supposed to get finance at, and if it goes 1 or 2 days over, you may be up for losing a portion of your deposit or a percentage of the buy price, right?
Exactly, yeah. And it's really, like I said, it's going to come down to how good your conveyancer is at that point as well, because I've seen some excellent conveyancers help a client get out of that situation, but you get what you pay for when it comes to conveyancing as well. So I think it's really important that as long as the communication's flowing and the conveyancer understands what's going on, they're going to be able to help you get that extension or pull out comfortably without loss.
Yeah, fair enough. And
it all comes back to getting organised at the start, doesn't it?
Well, that's it. I mean, which leads me to my next question is, like, what are the things that lenders typically ask for to get that pre-approval started and ticked off?
Yeah, and look, every lender is different in terms of their requirements. Where I work at NAB, we are a little bit lower doc and we have a very fast speed to approval. So generally speaking, particularly if they already bank with us, we're looking for 1 or 2 pay slips. We need a signed consent to proceed, obviously, or a verbal consent to proceed. If they've got their savings elsewhere, we need to evidence their savings. So to show genuine savings for their deposit. And then a signed contract. So for a very straightforward purchase, that is as much as we would need. If we're looking at someone that's got a little bit more of a complicated situation, there may be other things that we require, but generally speaking, it's pretty low doc from our point of view. But like I said, other lenders are a little bit different. But at a minimum, you need to be able to evidence your income. Now, if you're self-employed, we're moving into a whole different territory where we need financials and tax returns and notice of assessment. So ideally, if we're sitting here in October 2022, we'd be wanting to see that you've at least started your June 2022, but we're definitely going to need last year's. Coming out of COVID, that introduces another round of challenges for self-employed, because for many of our self-employed clients, there was an impact from COVID. So more and more people are trying to get us this year's financials because they tell a much better story. So self-employed is a whole nother conversation. Doesn't make it any harder to get your loan approved. You just have to have a little bit more documentation than someone who's pay as you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And so going back to like borrowing capacity, what's a good rule of thumb in terms of, I guess, if someone was curious about what they can borrow without having to put out a bunch of information, what are the main things that you would typically ask for to get that 5 or 10 minute kind of time frame to punch out that borrowing capacity calculator?
So we're looking at total income, so household income. We're looking at how many financial dependents are in the home. So that talks to living expenses. And we have a standard calculation that we use for living expenses when we're doing a borrowing capacity, but we do also want to understand what your household is spending. And at that point of pre-approval, we will actually have a look at transactions and have a look at what's going in and out and make sure that that aligns with the budget that you've given us, because there's often a discrepancy, and that's where those verifications can stumble. But in terms of a borrowing capacity, we're looking at income, financial dependence, and liabilities. So what liabilities have you got which impact your ability to borrow? So more and more we're seeing people taking on things like Afterpay, Zip Pay, your pay in fours, things like that. Multiple credit cards, Latitude's a big one, so like your store cards. Whenever you take one of those, you need to remember that will come into your liabilities and your ability to actually borrow to purchase. So if you've got a credit card for $5,000, we're going to be calculating your repayment at $5,000 on that. We don't care if you pay that to zero every month. That liability is still worth $5,000. So if you've got 3 or 4 of those, that will impact your borrowing capacity, and people don't realise that. Same with your Afterpays and your Zip Pays. We treat those as credit cards when we're calculating liabilities. Yeah, so think carefully when you start signing up for those things.
Yeah, for sure. They're the pitfalls that people don't realize until it's too late, or when the application's going through and there's close serviceability kind of issues, and then they'll be scrambling to cancel or do whatever they need to do to get it over the line. Yeah. Right? It's interesting.
Yeah. We do check the credit report. So we will see any liabilities that are disclosed or undisclosed. And it's not uncommon for us to have to get a couple of those closed off that aren't being used. But then you also need to provide evidence of closure. So just bear that in mind if you've got multiple facilities, that if you decide you need to close them off, we're going to need the closing statements as well.
Yeah. And during what stage of the process do you run that credit report for your clients?
At assessment, so pre-approval or formal approval. So when we hit that assess button to provide an approval or an outcome, that's when we check that credit report.
Yeah, so the work's really done up front, isn't it? Like you got to get prepared, you got to get organised so that you can dot all your I's, cross your T's, so that when you go out into the market, you've got negotiating power, as per what you said. You can go in at 7 days finance clause. It's much more appealing to a vendor versus someone who's looking at 14 or 21 days, right?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing, and I'll always come back to that emotional thing as well, though, but it just gives you the confidence to go in and actually negotiate, knowing exactly what you can, purchase up to. And look, there's always going to be that time when you go a little bit over, but having that good relationship with your lender, someone you can call on the spot on a Saturday when you're sitting there negotiating, saying, hey, can I put an extra 10 on this purchase? And that person can quickly work that out for you. But being able to go and do that with confidence definitely takes that overwhelm and that stress out of that moment. And I think, if you're purchasing a property, especially your first one, that should be a positive experience. That should be something that's memorable, not filled with angst and overwhelm. So being organised can definitely remove that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess veering into another direction now, just want to sort of explore what kind of mindset does one need to have when they're looking at acquiring a property or multiple properties at that? Like, what are the common themes that you've seen for the successful investors out there, or a really smooth run at it? What kind of frame of mind are they coming into it with?
I think for absolute success in that space, understanding what your objective is for that purchase. And yes, there's going to be people that are purchasing for their family because they want that home. And again, that's that emotional purchase and a valid one. But understanding what is your short, medium, and long-term objective for that purchase, because that's going to impact where and what you buy. And that comes right back, if we loop right back to my first piece of advice, get the right advisor so that your strategy is very firmly in place. But then you're going in with that, more of an investor mindset. Even if it is somewhere to live, you're still going in with the investor mindset, because at the end of the day, we're talking about money. We're not talking about a holiday. This is about money. This is, something that could potentially really make or break your financial future. So having a really smart approach to it, I think, is definitely going to be the best way to approach any of these purchases.
Yeah, for sure. And so tell me, what does the future look like for you? What are your plans? What are you trying to achieve?
Look, I've just, as you know, I've redirected my career. So I'm in my 40s and I've redirected my career. My kids one's a teenager, one's almost a teenager. So I've always had big goals and dreams for myself, and want to build my empire, but also help my children navigate what I know will be some of their most challenging years heading into adulthood. So continuing to be as present as I can, because I'm on my own with my kids. So be as present as I can, but also show them that, having a growth mindset and putting yourself first is also critically important. So it's something I've always tried to demonstrate for my children. That's kind of where I'm heading at the moment, just navigating teens and career, and making sure I continually feel challenged, because the minute I don't feel challenged, I tend to step back. So
that makes
making
sense.
sure I'm putting myself in uncomfortable positions, because that's where I thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned the growth mindset. Where did you come across that idea or that kind of mentality?
I've always had that, Andrew. So I've always had it ever since I was a teenager. I've always pushed myself. I was a dancer through my teens. So I've always pushed myself very hard, relentlessly, but I've always had a growth mindset. And I think also running a business for 10 years and leading a team, and helping them grow as coaches and personal trainers and nutritionists has always been, it's always kind of, I've had to lead by example. So it's been pretty rare in my career where I haven't been pushing myself hard. So, and I enjoy that.
That's awesome. And one of the key, I guess, the common theme from what I've seen from my experience is the people who actually go out there and have that go-getter attitude, have that growth mindset. And they're typically the ones who get the output or the results that they actually want, because they're willing enough to take a step back and see what's available to them, and then make the right moves so that they can speed up the process of achieving their goals. And far too many people have got that closed mindset where they're not open to any new ideas or any new ways of going about things. So that's a really, really important factor in growth and development and success in life, right? And in all aspects of life, not necessarily just finance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also, it then determines the way you look after your customers as well. I'm prepared to push very hard to get an outcome for my customers. And I think that comes from just having that growth mindset as well. It takes a fair bit for me to give up and surrender to a declined outcome. Like, I'll push pretty hard for my customers. So.
Yeah, nice. Now, so we're obviously in an inflationary period, right? So the rates are increasing. What are your thoughts about this, and how are your clients, I guess, maneuvering through that? What do you tell them? How do you get them prepared for potential future rate rises, that kind of thing? What do you say?
It's a challenging time. Like, I'll be honest with you, it's definitely a challenging time. And every time the rates go up, which I think they're going to again, is it today? Tuesday? Yep. Every time the rates move, some people do lose their pre-approvals, or it gets a little bit tighter for them. We assess with an affordability rate applied, which I think most lenders have to, which allows us to check that, you're still going to be able to manage this loan after a couple more rate rises and a whole bunch of inflation. So we practice responsible lending, and we make sure that we're not just approving this based on your current scenario. And I would encourage anyone to check that their lender, whoever they're going to, is also putting that buffer in place, because you don't want to just be able to afford this now, because if the rates keep going up, that's going to put your family under pressure. So if you're only just getting it through, you need to have a really good hard look at your budget, because it's going to get tough, because I don't think things are going to get any easier anytime soon. I hope I'm wrong, but I think we really need to allow for that buffer. And that's the conversation that I have with all of my clients. So, I'll always come back to responsible lending. We don't want to put anyone in a position where they're going to lose their home or not be able to eat intentionally. So we want to make sure that we're keeping people comfortable and moving forward. And if we put people in a position where they're only just affording that loan, we're not serving those people. So that's where I'll always come back to. If something looks tight to me, even if my computer says it's okay, I'll still always have a really good conversation with that client about whether or not it's the right decision for them.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing you want to do is to be forced to sell something, especially at the wrong time. Right.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to see that happen, sadly, more and more, because there are lenders that will take people right up to the edge of their budget. And I think, we're moving into a space now where we're going to see that start to hurt a little bit. So, just make sure there's a buffer there. Make sure you're not, this is another one that I'll talk to customers about, make sure you're not downplaying your expenses to get a loan through. I mean, a good lender will check your transactions and make sure, but make sure you're not doing that just to make things look more affordable to you, because that means you either have to significantly adjust your lifestyle to make that work, or you're putting yourself in a position where you won't be able to afford your mortgage repayments.
Yeah, that's it. Because, I mean, a $500,000 loan with a 1% increase is an extra $5,000 out of pocket, right? And that's $100 a week out of pocket. It could be make or break for some families. And you alluded to a budget earlier, and a buffer earlier. It's crucial. It's crucial to get that buffer right, because it gives you confidence that you can weather the storm for whether it be 3 to 6 months, or in that case, if it's $5,000 and if you've got $50,000 worth of buffer, well, you've got 10 years of that extra 1% increase. If it's a 2% increase, you've got 5 years at the very least to kind of work your way through. Now, some people who are getting really, really close to the mark in terms of budget and really kind of straining themselves. What would you say to that? Because one of the key strategies that we talk about is, well, how do you relieve the pressure a little bit? Like, have you talked to them about going from P&I to interest only for maybe 1 or 2 years just to relieve the pressure as well?
Yeah, and look, I don't work in the space where we'll renegotiate an existing loan. So that would definitely move into more of our hardship space. But what I would say to people is you don't just look at your interest rate and what an interest rate hike is going to mean to you. For anyone that's got kids, for example, like myself, have a look at what their expenses are going to look like over the next couple of years as well. Like, if you've got a child that's moving into high school, have you got a child that's going to start some sport? Have you got... In my case, I've got a son who's about to become a teenager and his appetite's increasing. There's all of these incidental expenses that change over time with your family that you also need to consider. So it's not just that 0.5% increase every month. There's all of the other costs that are going to increase with your family as your family grows as well. But in terms of renegotiating a loan, if things are getting hard, talk to your bank. If you've got a loan and it's getting hard, talk to your bank sooner rather than later. Don't let it slip into collections or slip into arrears, because that's going to affect you long term. Most banks will be more than happy to talk to you about renegotiating to interest only, or even part interest only, part P&I, or even taking a repayment holiday if things are really tough. But by having that communication with your bank before it gets tough, preserves your credit for later. Because if you default on your loan now, you're going to have issues later if things improve and you want to buy another property. So we see way too many people just suffer until it's too late. So talk early.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's better to be transparent with these things and have that conversation early. Just like business owners, right, with their taxes and stuff like that. If you can't afford to pay for your taxes soon, well, you can come up with a payment plan of sorts, and the ATO is open to that conversation. I mean, if you ignore it and let things kind of escalate, it could get pretty ugly for you, right? Very easily.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, banks aren't monsters. They want to help you. They don't want to repossess your home. They don't want to default you, but you have to open that conversation first. So having that conversation early, you'd be surprised what they're prepared to do to help.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
And in terms of, I guess, tips for the people out there, I'd like to ask you for two tips. The first cohort is the people who are looking to acquire their first homes. What would be your top three tips for them?
Okay. Tip one: get the right team, which we've covered off on. So get your advisor, get your lender, get your conveyancer. Tip two is to look at the first home loan deposit scheme because it's a great scheme. So if you're looking at buying your first property to move into, the government has an amazing scheme in place at the moment. And I think any first home buyer is crazy not to at least look at it to see if they're eligible, because there is strict eligibility. And different banks have different numbers of places available, and there are still places available. Tip number three is take the time to really understand your budget first. Don't just go, oh, my repayments are going to be the same as my rent. That's fine, but there's other things that have to get factored in, and they are things like rates, maintenance, and I reckon 8 out of 10 first home buyers tell me they won't have maintenance costs. They will. They definitely will. So understand what it's going to cost you to actually own a property versus renting. I know I'm a renter. If anything breaks, my landlord pays for it. Anything. All right. Once you own a property, there's no landlord that's going to pay those repairs for you. So you have to factor all of those extra costs in. If you're looking at buying an apartment, and a lot of first home buyers are now, you've got to think about your body corporate and strata fees as well. So have a look at those costs before you go and sign up for anything, because they're really important.
Yeah, those are sneaky ones, right? Like if you're not accounting for those things, and suddenly you got $100 or $150 per week worth of body corp, holy moly, you might get into trouble. And in terms of apartments as well, like there's some certain rules, right? So under 50 square meters, there's a little bit harder to get finance on, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So different banks will shade differently, but generally speaking, if it's less than 50 square meters, you're probably going to struggle to borrow above 70% of that purchase price.
Yeah, for sure.
Again, lender dependent, because we all have different policies.
And how about, so the second tip, the second cohort of audience that I want to sort of tap into are the investors out there. Mm-hmm. What kind of tips or advice would you give to the investor who's looking to acquire multiple properties and build a solid property portfolio for themselves?
Sure, not dissimilar. Get the right team and make sure you have a really clear strategy in place. For an investor in particular, I would be definitely encouraging a buyer agent, because you're investing. So you're making a strategic financial purchase. There's not a lot of emotion that goes into an investment purchase. This is about money. So get a really good buyer agent who understands your strategy. Second one for me with investors is understand the costs up front. So we often get, a mum and dad who've got their first home that they're living in. Now they want to leverage their equity to buy an investment property. They have no idea what that stamp duty is going to cost, and it is a lot higher. So make sure you check for your state, because it's different state to state. And also understand what your interest rate will be, because interest rates on investment loans will be higher. So just because you've got a nice rate on your owner occupied doesn't mean that you're going to get the same on your investment loan. And then if you decide to go interest only, it may be higher again. So understanding your costs on that one as well. But again, getting your pre-approval in place first, always.
Yeah. Great. And Chantal, this is a bit of a different question. Like, if you had your time again, what would you be doing differently to build, I guess, your wealth in terms of the wealth creation side of things? What would you have done a little bit differently to get a better result for today?
For me personally?
Yeah. If you let's say you go back into time 20 years ago,
Oh, how long have you got?
We've got plenty of time.
Look, probably talking to someone like yourself first, not to blow smoke up, but just genuinely understand, to speak to someone who comes from an advisor space that understands property. I've sold properties that I wish desperately I'd held on to. But yeah, definitely for me, just getting that right property advice but holding on to property and getting into the property market earlier, because I'm divorced and out of that market now, and now I'm sitting in a position where it's just so much harder to get in. So yeah, I wish I'd gone back and gotten the right advice early on for myself.
Yeah, that's a big lesson, isn't it? I just had Terry Ryder in the podcast recently, and he said the same thing. Ideally, never sell. He's saying if you've got a robust property, never ever sell it, because it's an asset that keeps growing, especially if you got the right one, right? So the challenge is getting in and staying in and accumulating as you go. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Now, where can the audience find you, Chantal?
Yeah, look, when you release the podcast, I can give you my contact details for that if you like. Otherwise,
I'll make sure to put it in the description below the video. For sure.
I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Fantastic, on LinkedIn. Yeah. Brilliant. And any final thoughts before we wrap up?
In terms of final thoughts, I'll always keep looping back to get the right team. I think it's something that you say as well. We've both said that. Have the right team, have the right lender. Think of your lender as a GP or a doctor, someone that you need to be able to confide in, talk to openly, someone who's available as well. Am I available every weekend 24/7? No, but I am available a lot more than a lot of lenders, and I think that that's really important, because when do most people go looking for a property? It's on a Saturday or a Sunday. So having that conversation and laying down those expectations early so that you've got someone that's accessible, I think, is critically important. Just get the right team, some people that you gel with.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I guess one of the key things to add to that is that you alluded to it earlier. If they can articulate how they can help you and how they can, I guess, simplify a complex situation, that's a lot better, because you don't want to be, I call it passing the sleep test. You don't want to be losing sleep at night when you're making these decisions, right? It's got to pass the sleep test. It's got to make sense so that you're absolutely comfortable before moving forward. Because if you're not comfortable, you might have some doubt in there. And if you're doubting yourself in any kind of situation, once you're trying to acquire a property, well, it could be, you could miss out, right? Because in a market like we're in today, you have to know, and you have to be confident that you've got your team behind you and you're moving forward with confidence. Because if you're sort of doubting yourself, it's very, very difficult to get in. And a lot of our clients who've tried to do it themselves have found it very difficult. And obviously a lot of the public find it very, very difficult as well. So it's crucial to get that right.
Yeah. Oh, no, well said. I've got a lot of clients that have been looking for 3, 6, 9 months, and they're just stuck in the property market, just not having any success. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, good. Well, Chantal, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time and your expertise and your knowledge. Really, really appreciate you coming along to the podcast. Looking forward to maybe catching up in a few months' time, or maybe in 6 months' time. We can talk more finance and see where the economy's at, and chop it up even further then.
Sounds great. Thanks, Andrew.
Have a good one. We'll chat soon.
Thanks.
Okay,
bye.
ciao.